Chapter 1. Coins in Dead Men's Mouths. Dawn in Grissenhafen came like a bruise spreading across the sky, purple-black to sickly grey light that didn't so much arrive as seep into everything and make it look worse. The river was the first thing to wake, pushing its cold, silt-thick breath through the docks in a low fog that clung to ropes and pilings like wet wool. Lanterns guttered in their cages. Rats made their final bold runs before day drove them back into cracks. The fishermen found the body when they went to unshackle the nets. It hung from a warehouse beam above the quay, swaying gently in the river breeze, boots tapping the timber with a dull, patient rhythm. Someone had hauled him up with care. Rope looped clean, knot tight, no slack wasted. There was even a rag tied around the beam to protect the rope from fraying, as if the hangman had once done honest work in the rigging trade. The man's face was turned toward the water, chin tucked like he'd gone to sleep standing. His skin had the waxy pallor of something left too long in a cellar. The mouth gaped slightly, lips cracked, and where a throat should have been a single line of flesh, there was ruin, ragged, torn, dark, with dried blood that had run down his chest in brittle sheets. Not the neat slit of a knife, not the precise puncture of a hunter's bolt. Something had taken him the way a dog takes a chicken. "Sigmar preserve," muttered old Fenwick, who'd hauled nets on this river since before his spine decided it hated him. His hands clenched and unclenched, fingers white against the rope he held. That's Janko's cousin, the one with the scar on his ear." "Don't say names," hissed his mate, a young man with fish scales stuck to his coat and fear stuck to his eyes. "Don't. If what hears?" Fenwick snapped, then immediately regretted it, because sound carried strangely in fog. He spat into the river and watched the spit vanish. "It's dead. Whatever did, it's gone." The young fisherman pointed with a trembling finger. "Look." The corpse's pockets bulged in an obscene way, like tumors. The fabric of his breeches was stretched, seams strained. The young man took one half-step forward and then stopped, as though the ground itself had warned him. Fenwick muttered another prayer and reached up with his gaff hook, lifting the hem of the man's coat. Coins spilled out in a glittering clatter, raining down onto the boards and into the river. Copper and silver, a few hammered bits of gold. Some rolled between planks and vanished into the dark below. Others skittered to a stop against boots and barrels. The sound was too bright for the hour, too cheerful for what it meant, and that was when they noticed the wrists. Not just rope marks, everyone who'd ever been hauled into the watchhouse had them, sooner or later. These were raw, the flesh abraded in neat bands where he'd been bound and dragged, as if he'd fought the rope until it bit through skin. 2 parallel lines on each wrist, like he'd been secured twice, once to restrain him, once to display him. "A staged hanging," Fenwick said, voice flat. It was the sort of thing a man says when he needs words to hold on to. They hung him up like a warning," the young fisherman swallowed, "and filled his pockets with coin." "Not filled," Fenwick corrected, staring at the glittering scatter. "Stuffed, like a butcher packs a sausage." By the time the watch arrived, the docks had done what docks always did. Spread the story faster than fire, in dry straw, and with twice the relish. People came to see, not because they were brave, because they were human. They gathered at the quay in a knot of faces, dockhands with thick fists and thinner patience, fishwives with knives still in their aprons, boatmen, porters, beggars who smelled opportunity even in horror. The fog pressed in around them, turning every pair of eyes into something floating. "Witchwork," someone whispered, and the word went through the crowd like a rat through flour. "Cult," said another, louder. I told you there's folk meeting down by the old tannery, lighting candles and saying names." "A curse," croaked a woman with a scarf over her mouth. "That river's cursed. Sylvania's rot seeps down the water." "Hang the witches," barked a broad man with a scar across his nose. "Hang 'em before they hang us." The first thrown stone hit the warehouse wall with a wet slap. The second hit a watchman's helmet. Then the noise rose, shouts, curses, the hungry chant of frightened people looking for something they could strike. Captain Liese Kranz arrived with a dozen watchmen and the look of a woman who'd slept in armor because she didn't trust her bed. She was tall in a plain way, coat patched at the elbows, sword at her hip with a scabbard worn smooth by use. Her hair was bound tight beneath a cap, and her jaw had the set of someone used to being disagreed with by men twice her size. "Back!" she shouted, voice cutting through the crowd. "Back from the key! I'll have order, or I'll have heads." The chant faltered, not from respect, but from recognition. Kranz meant what she said. Two of her watchmen shoved people away with halberd shafts. "Not gentle." A fishwife snapped at them. One shoved her harder, and she went down in the wet boards cursing. A dockhand raised his fist and got a baton across the knuckles for his trouble. Kranz didn't look at the fallen. She looked up. The corpse swung above them, a pendulum measuring the town's failing heartbeat. "Got him down," she ordered. No one moved. Even the watchmen hesitated. Superstition had a grip on Grissenhafen, stronger than any law. Bodies didn't hang like that without reason. Things that did that didn't like their work being disturbed. Kranz's gaze swept her men, hard as iron. Now, a young watchman barely grown into his helmet stepped forward with a knife. His hands shook as he climbed a ladder propped against the warehouse wall. Every rung creaked like it was complaining. The fog wrapped him, and for a moment he looked like a boy climbing into a grave. He saw the throat up close and made a sound that wasn't quite a gag, wasn't quite a sob. He cut anyway. The body fell with a dull thud, heavy and boneless. Coins spilled again, clinking like laughter. Someone in the crowd made a strangled noise, half awe, half hunger, and Kranz snapped her head around. "Touch nothing," she warned. "Any man or woman caught taking coin from a murder victim will join him." "Is it murder if he deserved it?" someone called, and a few chuckles answered. Kranz's eyes narrowed. "Is it theft if you starve?" She shot back, and the chuckles died. She crouched by the corpse, ignoring the wet, and tugged open the coat. A stitched patch marked the inside, lining an old guild stamp from the river port, Dock Laborers Association. The man had worked here once. That meant the town would care at least enough to riot. Kranz glanced at the pockets. "These coins are the ones he stole?" said a voice behind her, calm and low. The crowd shifted as priest Othmar Voss pushed through, black robes brushing against rough coats. He wore the symbol of Morr, a raven's skull on a chain, resting on his chest like a judgment. His face was lean, lined, his eyes the dark of old bruises. He looked like a man who had spent too long in graveyards and come to prefer their honesty. "Kranz Rose, Father Voss." "Who?" "Captain." His gaze flicked to the corpse, and he did not flinch. He studied the throat, the rope, the spilled coin, with the patience of someone reading a sermon carved into bone. One of Kranz's men muttered, "Morr's birds always come when there's meat," Voss heard. He smiled without warmth. "And Sigmar's dogs always come when there's fear." Kranz ignored the jab. "You think this is not a cult?" Voss said, and stepped closer. He bent, careful not to kneel in the blood, and took the corpse's hand in his own gloved fingers. He turned the wrist slightly, inspecting the marks. "The binding was deliberate," he murmured. "Two ties, one to drag, one to hang. Whoever did this wanted him displayed, yes, but also corrected." His eyes moved to the pockets. These coins weren't tossed. They were placed, stuffed, as you might stuff a reliquary with offerings. "A message," Kranz said. "A sermon." Voss lifted his gaze to the warehouse beam above. "And sermons are for the living." One of the dockhands spat. "So what? Some preacher of rot thinks he's saving us? We should drag him out, and—" Kranz's baton cracked against a piling, the sound sharp. "Enough. I'll not have a lynch mob deciding law." The dockhand's face flushed. "Law? The law takes bribes and lets rat men run the alleys. This," he jabbed a finger at the corpse, "this is justice." "Justice doesn't tear a man apart," Voss said softly. The dockhand hesitated, and in that half-second of silence, everyone heard something they hadn't noticed. The river had gone quiet. Not still, rivers never were, but quiet in a way that made the world feel paused. Kranz felt the hairs on her arms rise under her coat. "Clear the docks," she snapped to her men. "Anyone lingering gets a night in the cells." Grumbling, the crowd began to thin. Though not far, people drifted to doorways and windows instead, eyes peering, ready to pounce on fresh rumor. Merchants slammed shutters. A few criminals, recognizable by the way they moved like they expected to be, melted away into fog. Kranz turned to Voss. "If not a cult, then what?" Voss's gaze remained fixed upward, to the roofline. "Something that knows the language of punishment. Something that wants to be seen as righteous." Kranz snorted. "Bandits can be righteous." "Bandits don't hang men from beams like trophies," Voss replied. "And they don't return stolen coin. That is fixation. Ritual." He lowered his voice. "I've seen such neatness before, Captain. In places where the dead will not stay down." Kranz's jaw tightened. "Don't say it." Voss met her eyes. "Sylvania is a day's ride upriver. The border is a line on a map, not a wall. Rot crosses." Before Kranz could answer, a shout erupted from down the quay. "There!" someone screamed, pointing upward. "On the roofs!" A woman, one of the fishwives, face pale beneath grime, stood with her hands clasped at her mouth. "I saw it," she babbled. "Last night. I couldn't sleep, and I looked out, and there it was up there like stone, like a church gargoyle, watching." Kranz followed her pointing finger. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but slate roofs slick with dew and fog curling in ribbons. Then movement, a shape, hunched and wrong, silhouetted against the paling sky. It was too large to be a man, too still to be a beast. It crouched near a chimney like it belonged there. Then it moved, not a scramble, not a run, a glide of limbs that seemed to use the roof itself as leverage. It vanished behind a gable with a speed that made Kranz's stomach drop. "After it!" she barked. The watch surged, boots slapping on wet boards. They poured into the alleyways leading away from the docks, halberds raised, lanterns swinging. Kranz ran with them, breath sharp in her lungs, sword half drawn. Voss did not run. He followed at a measured pace, his hand on the raven's skull at his chest, lips moving in a prayer that tasted like iron. They found the ladder by instinct. Someone always had a ladder leaning against something in a river town. A watchman shoved it against a wall and climbed, boots slipping on the rungs. Another followed, then another. Kranz went up third, her fingers cold on the wood. The roofline greeted her with wet slate and a drop that would break her neck. Fog rolled over the shingles, making distance a lie. Chimneys rose like broken teeth. "Spread," she ordered. "Don't bunch up." A scream cut her off. One of her men, a big fellow named Heller, broad shoulders, loud laugh, had gotten ahead, rounding a chimney. He stopped as if he'd hit a wall. Then something yanked him upward, not dragged along the roof up. His boots left the slate. His arms flailed. His halberd clattered away, sliding down toward the gutter. Heller's mouth opened, but the scream that came out was strangled, as though his throat had been seized. Kranz lunged, grabbing at his belt. Her fingers caught leather for a moment, then slipped as Heller was jerked out of her grasp like a doll snatched by a child. He disappeared into the fog above the roofline. For a second, there was only the rattle of her own breath and the soft patter of dew. Then something fell. A watch cap, spinning, landing with a wet slap against the slate. It rolled to a stop near Kranz's boot. A dark smear marked it. One of the younger watchmen made a sound that was pure panic. He backed away, slipping, nearly tumbling off the far side of the roof. Another dropped to his knees and retched onto the shingles. Kranz forced her voice steady. "Hold! Hold your ground!" But her men were already looking at the fog like it had teeth. A shape shifted within it. Not clearly seen, never clearly. Just the suggestion of a hunched outline, too close, too high. A pair of glints that might have been eyes, might have been rain catching on something sharp. Kranz raised her sword. "Show yourself." The fog did not answer. It simply moved, and the thing was gone again, leaving only the echo of Heller's strangled cry. They searched, because they had to. They edged along ridges and gables, peering into chimneys, thrusting halberd points into the mist like blind men poking at darkness. They found nothing but wet slate and their own fear. When they climbed down, the docks were waiting with new whispers. Someone had already decided it was a demon. Someone else was sure it was a witch. A third was loudly convinced it was the work of Sylvanian bloodsuckers, and that everyone should nail garlic to their doors. Kranz shoved past them, face rigid, and marched straight to the watchhouse to start raids. If the town wanted a monster, she would give them suspects. Better broken knuckles in her cells than torches in the streets. Doors were kicked in. Alley dens were overturned. Men were dragged from dice games and shoved against walls. A known fence was hauled in by his hair. A boy with a stolen loaf was slapped until he cried. Kranz watched it all with eyes like chipped stone, because if she stopped to feel, she would drown in it. She wanted quick answers. She got none. The only thing she got was more fear. By midday, fog had lifted enough to reveal the town's ugliness in full. Crooked streets, sagging roofs, river water that looked like old tea. People stared at the watch with a mix of hatred and hope. They expected protection. They expected scapegoats. They would accept either. When the sun leaned low and weak behind clouds, Voss returned to the dock warehouse alone. He moved like a man who had spent years learning to walk quietly among the dead. The quay was mostly empty now. A few gulls argued over fish guts. A rat skittered away when he approached. The beam from which the corpse had hung still bore the rope's imprint. Someone had cut the rope and left a short length dangling, twisting in the breeze like a question. Voss climbed the ladder slowly, one hand on the wood, one hand on his symbol. At the top, he examined the beam in the fading light. There, caught on a nail, half hidden beneath splinters, was a scrap of cloth. He pinched it between gloved fingers and pulled it free. Black cloth, stiff with dried mud. The weave was too fine for a dockhand, and on its edge was a narrow-stitched band. Deep, muted purple, the color of Morr's mourning rites. Voss held it up, letting the light catch the thread. It was not fresh. It had been worn, used, perhaps even blessed once. Or perhaps it had been dyed to imitate blessing. Either way, it was a mockery. A laugh drifted up from somewhere a dockhand below, telling a crude joke to chase away his own nerves. The sound made Voss's skin crawl, because it reminded him how desperately the living tried to pretend the world was not sharpening its teeth. He folded the cloth scrap carefully and tucked it into his robe. Then he looked up at the rooftops beyond the docks, where chimneys stood like sentries and slate glistened under the last of the day's weak light. Somewhere up there, something watched. Not a cult, not a drunken killer, not a simple beast. Something that understood symbols, something that returned stolen coin like a priest returning offerings, something that hung bodies like sermons and wore the color of Morr like a stolen mantle. Voss's lips moved in a prayer that was not for protection. Morr did not offer that. Morr offered boundaries. "Keep your dead," Voss whispered to the fog. "And if you won't, then grant me the strength to put you back where you belong." Above, on some unseen roofline, slate creaked softly as if something heavy had shifted its weight and settled in to listen. Chapter 2. The Cult That Wasn't. By noon the fog had thinned into a dirty veil, and Grissenhafen showed its teeth. The river town clung to the water like a leech black timbers, sagging roofs, warped docks that groaned with every footstep. Barges moved slow as funeral processions. The gulls screamed like things being punished. Every alley stank of fish rot, wet wool, and the sour tang of fear sweated into old wood. Fear was a currency here. It bought rumors, it bought prayers, it bought knives, and Magister Huldrych Rain meant to spend it lavishly. He arrived at the watch-house with a cloak the color of dried blood and a hat with a brim wide enough to hide behind. His badge was not famous, not one of the great names whispered in taverns, but it was real enough to make men swallow their words. It glinted on his chest as if hungry for sunlight that never quite reached this town. Captain Kranz stood behind her desk like it was a barricade. Her eyes were rimmed red from sleeplessness, her jaw set hard enough to crack teeth. Rain did not sit. He paced, boots clicking on the watchhouse boards. He enjoyed the sound, liked how it made everyone listen. "You have a panic," he said. "A whispering riot with fists. Good. Panic makes people honest. It makes them stupid," Kranz replied. and stupid crowds burn the wrong houses. Rain's mouth twitched, almost a smile. So we give them the right house. Kranz's stare could have hammered nails. We don't have one. Rain lifted a hand, fingers pinched together as if holding a delicate point. We do. We merely haven't named it yet. Voss stood in the back, half in shadow, his Morr symbol resting heavy against his chest. He watched Ren with the same expression he reserved for grave worms. Not disgust, exactly more a weary recognition that rot was rot. Rain's gaze flicked to him. Ah, the Raven's priest, still sniffing at corpses? I bury them, Voss said. You collect them. Rain ignored the bob. He turned back to Kranz. Listen carefully, Captain. A town does not want mystery. A town wants a story. A story has a villain, preferably one you can hang before the week is out. Kranz leaned forward. And if your villain isn't the right one? Rain spread his hands. Then the right one continues until your docks are strung with bodies and your merchants flee and your river traffic dries up. You will have no wages, no food, no peace. Your town will die not of a monster, but of uncertainty. He stopped pacing and pointed toward the barred window, where the town beyond seemed to press in with its muttering, restless pulse. So we find the shape of a culprit that fits the fear. Voss's voice cut in, flat. A scapegoat. Rain's eyes hardened. A solution. Kranz's fingers tightened on the desk edge. You're pushing the cult theory. Because it works, Rain said. Because there are always cults. There are always fools gathering in basements, whispering to the dark, hoping it whispers back. And because a cult can be rooted out with torches and confession. Confession, Voss repeated softly, and there was a chill in the word. Rain stepped closer to Kranz, lowering his voice like a man offering a bargain. Your men saw a shape on the roofs. Your fisher folk found a hung thief with coins returned. That reeks of fanaticism. A preacher in rags, a secret sect. River mystics pick your poison. Give the town something it understands. And if it isn't a cult? Kranz asked. Rain's grin showed no warmth. Then it is still useful. He turned on his heel and barked an order to the watch sergeant waiting by the door. Bring in the grave robbers. Bring in the dockside charm sellers. Bring me anyone who smells of incense and lies. We will squeeze the truth out of them. The watchhouse became a grinder. Men were dragged in with mud on their knees and terror in their mouths. Tomb scratchers caught near the Morr gardens. River mystics with bone charms tied to their wrists. A toothless woman who sold blessed salt in the market. They were shoved into cells, questioned, slapped, threatened. Kranz watched with a kind of grim restraint. She was not gentle, but she was not Rain. Rain wanted spectacle. He wanted something that looked like progress. He found it in a rat catcher. They brought him in at dusk, a thin, hunched man with a sack that twitched faintly, like something inside still alive. He smelled of piss and cheap smoke. Around his neck hung a necklace of small carved bones and cracked beads. I ain't done nothing, he wheezed as the watchman threw him onto the floorboards. His cheek hit hard. He left a smear of blood when he lifted his face again. I catch rats. That's all. Ren crouched in front of him, close enough that the rat catcher could smell the polished leather and faint perfume of authority. Ren plucked the necklace between thumb and forefinger. This is not all, Rain said. These are charms. They keep the bites off, the rat-catcher rasped, eyes darting. They, my gran, she said. Rain smiled. Your gran told you how to bargain with darkness? The rat-catcher shook his head violently. No, it's just old things. Lucky things. Rain stood and nodded once to the sergeant. Take him below. Kranz's voice snapped. Magister. Rain cut her off without looking. You want the town to stop screaming? Then let me work. They took the rat-catcher to the cellar, where the watch kept its worst tools, damp stone, iron rings in the wall, and a drain in the floor that never truly ran clear. A lantern hissed with smoky light. The air tasted of old sweat and fear. Rats skittered in the cracks bold, watching, as if they'd come to see a cousin at work. Voss hovered at the top of the cellar stairs, refusing to descend. His hands were clenched inside his sleeves. Morr taught that death was sacred, that bodies were not toys, torture was not death. But it played in the same gutter. Rain rolled up his sleeves with deliberate neatness. Name the others, he said, as if the rat-catcher was a man at a tavern refusing to pay his tab. I don't know no others, the rat-catcher sobbed. I'm not. Please, I'm just... Rain's fist moved like a butcher's mallet. It slammed into the rat-catcher's stomach. The man folded with a wet gasp, bile stringing from his lips. A watchman hauled him upright by the hair, and Rain hit him again, harder, until the rat-catcher's legs trembled like reeds. Name the others, Rain repeated, voice calm. There ain't, the rat-catcher choked. No cult. No, Rain nodded to the sergeant, who produced a pair of pliers. Not ornate, not ritual, just practical iron. Kranz's face went pale in the lantern light. She did not stop it. She told herself she couldn't. She told herself the town needed answers. She told herself 100 things and felt each one rot as it formed. The rat-catcher screamed until his throat went raw. He babbled names that weren't names. Old Tanner at the docks, the man with the red scarf, someone in the tannery. Anything to make it stop. Wren listened, patient as a spider. But the more the rat-catcher lied, the more the cellar filled with the simple, brutal truth that there was no cult here, only desperation and pain. Finally, trembling and broken, the rat-catcher lifted his head, eyes unfocused, and whispered something that froze the cellar. Stone judge, he croaked. On the roofs. Rain stilled. Kranz's breath caught. Even the watchman holding the pliers paused, as if afraid the words might bite. The... what? Rain asked, voice suddenly sharper. The rat-catcher swallowed, blood and spit. Last night, he wheezed. I saw it. I was out by the warehouse rats. Don't wait for day, do they? And I looked up, and it was there. Hunched. Like one o' them church beasts. Just watchin'. Like it was weighing folk. Like it... His eyes rolled back. He sagged in the watchman's grip. Rain stared at him for a long moment, then straightened slowly, expression unreadable. See, he said to Kranz, as if he'd won an argument. A story. Voss's voice came down the stairs like a knife. A story. You carved into him. Rain did not look up. Stories are carved into everyone, priest. Some simply bleed more. Above, the town groaned into night, and in the taverns of Grissenhafen, men drank harder, laughed louder, and checked the ceiling beams with eyes that refused to linger. The deserter died outside the Black Eel. He was found before dawn, of course. They always were, like the town was being forced to witness its own punishment in the first light, when every face looked guilty. The Black Eel sign swung above the door, a painted fish with a wicked grin. Beneath it, from the sign beam itself, hung a man in a mud-stained soldier's coat. His boots were mismatched. One sock had slid halfway down his ankle. His hands were bound behind him, wrists raw and angry, his head lolled forward, chin resting against his chest. His throat again was ruined. Not neat, not surgical. A violent tearing that had left the collar soaked dark and stiff. The smell hit first. Iron, old blood, cold meat. His pockets bulged obscenely, heavy with coin. Some had spilled onto the cobbles, gleaming wet in the lantern light like eyes. The tavern patron stood in the doorway in a tight cluster, pale and silent. A woman sobbed quietly into her hands. A man clutched a tankard like a weapon. No one dared step closer. Captain Kranz arrived with her watch, jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. Magister Rain arrived with satisfaction barely hidden beneath a frown. Priest Voss arrived last, moving through the crowd like a shadow with a purpose. "This one," Rain said, lips curling, "is your cult's work, no doubt. A deserter. He's not a thief," Kranz snapped. "He's a soldier." Rain lifted an eyebrow. "And soldiers cannot sin?" Voss stepped forward, ignoring them both. He studied the body, eyes narrowing at details. He reached into the dead man's coat carefully and drew out a crumpled scrap of paper, a writ with an imperial seal, smeared and damp. Desertion notice, a name written in harsh ink, but the name did not match the man's face. Voss checked the dead man's boots. One had a regiment mark scraped half away. "He lied," Voss murmured. Kranz glanced at him sharply. "What?" "He lied about who he was," Voss said, "and he stole." He reached into one pocket and pulled out a torn heel of bread, hard as wood. Not coin, bread, hunger, theft. Rain's smile returned, thin. So criminal. Voss's eyes flashed. "He was running from war," he said, voice low. "Not from justice." Kranz stared at the body, as if seeing it anew. "He begged, didn't he?" she asked quietly. Voss nodded once. "You can see it in the binding. He fought the rope. He pleaded. Whoever did this wanted him to know he was judged." The crowd murmured, the word judged spreading like a stain. Rain raised his voice for them, theatrical. "Behold, a warning to cowards, thieves, and traitors. Whoever this killer is, he understands the law better than you?" Kranz hissed. Rain's eyes narrowed. "Careful." Kranz turned away before she said something that would put her in chains. She gestured to her men. "Cut him down." As they did, coins clattered again, bright, obscene, rolling into gutters and between stones. A child in the crowd darted forward on instinct, hand reaching toward a silver piece, and his mother yanked him back with a sharp slap that left a red mark on his cheek. The child cried, more shocked than hurt. Kranz watched that slap and felt something sour in her stomach. The killer wasn't only hanging bodies, he was teaching the town. Voss stayed after the watch cleared the scene. He spoke to the tavern keeper, to a frightened serving girl, to an old veteran nursing a shaking hand. Piece by piece, he gathered the dead man's last night. A soldier with hollow eyes, a fake name offered too quickly, a plea for a corner to sleep in, a promise to work, a whispered prayer, and finally, a drunk who'd tried to bully him for entertainment. He kept saying he didn't want trouble, the serving girl said, voice trembling. He kept looking at the door, like something was outside already. Voss looked up at the tavern sign beam, at the rope marks on the wood, and felt the hairs on his arms rise. Later that day, the town's other hunger showed its face. Mara Kessel stood in the market with a basket that felt too light in her arms. She'd come for flour and left with only a handful of bruised onions and a small wedge of grey cheese that smelled faintly of mildew. Her coin purse was almost empty, its leather softened by too much rubbing and too little filling. Behind her, a shadow fell across the stall. "Morning, Mara," said a voice, like oil on water. She turned and saw Gert and Halv, the dockside lender's men who smiled the way blades gleamed. Their coats were better than they had any right to, their boots clean, their eyes always calculating. "You've missed a payment," Gert said pleasantly. "I haven't," Mara lied, because truth was dangerous. Captain Kranz's men took. There was a raid. Hell leaned in. He smelled of cheap spirits and expensive cruelty. "There's always a reason with you." Mara's throat went tight. "I'll pay. I just need—" Gert's hand closed around her wrist, not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to promise he could. "Need is for beggars," he said softly. "Debt is for sinners." Mara flinched at the word sinners, because everyone was using it now. Everyone was weighing everyone else with hungry eyes. She forced herself to meet his gaze. "I'm not a thief." Gert smiled wider. "No, you're worse. You owe." He released her wrist with a little pat, as if she were a child. "Tonight," he said, "or we start taking what you can't hide in a purse." They walked away, leaving Mara shaking, stomach hollow, thoughts racing in circles. "Run," her mind whispered. "Get on a barge. Go down river. Anywhere but here." Then she remembered the deserter hanging from the tavern sign like a lesson. "Coward, the town would call you. Traitor, criminal." And Mara, who had done nothing but borrow to eat, felt the river town close around her like a fist. That evening, as the sun bled into cloud and the streets filled with the restless shuffle of people who didn't want to be indoors and didn't dare be alone, someone found a carving. It was on a rooftop beam near the warehouse district, cut rough into the wood, as if by a knife, wielded without finesse but with conviction. A lopsided scale, one side heavier than the other, and beneath it a single word scratched deep enough to catch dirt. Balance. The message spread faster than the earlier rumor, because it was simple enough for everyone to understand and dangerous enough for everyone to fear. Rain called it proof of a cult. Kranz called it provocation. Voss called it blasphemy. At midnight, Voss returned to the Morr garden on the edge of town, where gravestones leaned like tired men and ravens watched from bare branches. He brought ash, salt, and a small brass bell used only in rites for the unquiet dead. He drew a circle at the garden's gate, careful and precise, and whispered the old words that told the dead to stay where they belonged. The wind shifted. The bell gave a faint tremor without being touched. Voss's breath fogged in front of him. He felt it then, not a presence like a man, not a warmth like a beast. Something older, something hungry, something that listened the way a judge listens to a confession, deciding what to do with it. Above the garden wall, beyond the graves, the rooftops rose like jagged teeth against the night, and in the darkness, on some unseen beam, something heavy settled into stillness, stone still, patient, watching the priest trace his boundaries. Voss did not look up. He kept his eyes on the circle and forced his voice not to shake. But he knew, with a certainty that made his stomach knot, that whatever haunted Grissenhafen was not merely killing. It was teaching, it was weighing, and it was learning how far it could push before the town broke. Chapter 3. A Monster with a Badge. Grissenhafen did not sleep anymore. It only pretended, shutters drawn, candles snuffed, prayers whispered into pillows, while ears stayed tuned for rope creak and boot scrape on slate. The river ran black beneath the docks, thick as old ink, carrying rumors downstream and bringing worse ones back. Every morning brought another body, or the promise of one. Every night tasted of damp wood and held breath. Captain Liese Kranz felt the town's fear like a weight strapped to her ribs. It pressed when she stood, when she ate, when she tried foolishly to close her eyes. The watchhouse stank of wet wool, sweat, cheap lamp oil, and the sourness of men who'd started believing their halberds were only good for leaning on. They were fracturing. She saw it in the way they spoke half-whispered jokes that weren't jokes at all, in the way some made the sign of Sigmar when they climbed ladders, then did it again and again, as though repetition might make it true, in the way others avoided rooftops entirely unless an officer stared them into motion, and she saw it worst in the eyes of Sergeant Brandt. Brandt had been with the watch longer than Kranz had worn her captain's sash. Broad, steady, the sort of man who could stare down a dock riot and make it blink first. Now his steadiness had turned into something else, an ugly calm that sat atop panic like a lid on boiling water. "He's doing what we can't," Brandt said one evening, voice low, as if offering a secret comfort. He stood beside Kranz at the watchhouse window, looking out across the market square where a few late hawkers hurried to pack their wares before night fully settled. Kranz didn't look at him. "He's murdering people." Brandt's jaw worked. "Thieves, deserters, those who break law, those who are poor," Kranz snapped. "Those who are frightened." Brandt's gaze slid away from her, uncomfortable. "Fear makes men do wrong," Kranz turned. "Fear makes men pay bribes." Brandt stiffened. Kranz held his stare until he looked away first. She could almost hear the crack in the watch's spine. Half of them wanted to believe the killings were holy punishment, because if they were, then the town wasn't helpless. The other half wanted coin enough to flee if it all collapsed. They took bribes to look away, to let certain doors remain unkicked, to let certain gangs keep their knives. And the killer, whatever he was learning who had bought themselves silence. Magister Huldrych Rain had been fanning it all with a careful hand, like a man stoking a fire that might burn his enemies as easily as his own house. That morning he'd ordered the cultist, the rat-catcher, dragged from the cellar and paraded through the streets in chains. It was meant to reassure the town. It only showed them the watch could still hurt someone. Rain stood on a wagon bed in the square, cloak crisp, badge bright, face arranged into pious severity. The rat-catcher slumped at his feet, bruised and shaking, eyes sunk in purple hollows. His mouth worked silently, as if he was still trying to spit out the taste of pliers and blood. Rain raised his voice. "Grissenhafen has been afflicted by wickedness, men who consort with dark forces, who invite judgment upon honest folk. Today we purge." Priest Othmar Voss watched from the edge of the crowd, face carved from grief. He did not step forward. He knew what Rain wanted. Opposition. Drama. A priest's outrage to make the spectacle sharper. Voss gave him nothing. Captain Kranz stood with her watch in a line, halberds angled outward to hold back the press of bodies. She hated the whole thing. She hated the way the crowd leaned in, hungry. She hated the way some of her own men watched, with a kind of relieved fascination, like the pain on the wagon was proof that pain could still be directed. Above the square, a bell tower stood empty and dark, its old stones slick with moss. It had once called the faithful to prayer. Now it only collected birds and rot. Voss felt it before he saw it, a prickling on the back of his neck, the sense of being weighed. He looked up. For the briefest moment, something hunched against the bell tower's broken railing motionless, a shape that could be mistaken for carved stone if you didn't know better. Then it was gone, swallowed by shadow. Voss's breath caught. He turned, slipping away from the crowd before anyone could follow. Boots, soft, on the mud. He moved like a man, answering a summons he couldn't refuse. He found the bell tower's door, half hanging on its hinges, warped and splintered by years of damp. The air inside smelled of old droppings and mildew. A thin shaft of light speared through a crack in the stonework, catching dust that drifted like pale ash. Voss climbed. The stairs spiraled up tight, worn into shallow grooves by generations of feet. His hands slid along the wall, touching slime-slick stone. He could hear his own breath, and above it nothing. No scrape, no rustle, no heartbeat. At the top, the bell chamber yawned open, beams crossed like ribs. The bell itself was cracked, greened with age, its clapper missing. Wind sighed through broken shutters. And in that wind, a voice spoke. "You bury what I balance." Voss froze. The figure stepped from behind a beam without the sound of a footfall. It was tall when it straightened, but it did not move like a tall thing. It moved like something that had learned human posture, as an imitation. Its shoulders hunched forward, as if it carried invisible weight. Its limbs were corded and spare, the way a starving animal's muscles show under hide. Its face was the worst of it, not because it was a skull, not because it was a monster in the obvious ways, but because it was almost a face a man could recognize. Cheekbones too sharp, mouth too wide, eyes too deep in shadow. It wore hair in lank ropes. Its skin had the pallor of stone kept in a cellar. A Strigoi. Voss's hand closed around his Morr symbol until the raven skull bit into his palm through the cloth. "Why lure me?" he asked, voice steady by discipline alone. The Strigoi's head tilted, listening to the words as if tasting them. "Because you understand death," it said. "You keep it in its garden. You lock it behind prayers." "I do," Voss replied. "And you break those locks." The Strigoi's mouth stretched in something that wasn't quite a smile. "I correct what you leave to fester. I am the rope. I am the beam. I am the hand that weighs. You are hunger," Voss said. "You dress it in law and call it virtue." The Strigoi's eyes glinted. "Hunger is honest. Men hide their hunger behind coins and contracts and oaths. I do not. I take only what is owed." "What is owed?" Voss echoed, and kept his distance one slow step back, placing a beam between himself and the creature without making it seem like retreat. "And what is that?" The Strigoi's voice softened, almost reverent. "Blood." Wind moaned through the broken shutters. The bell tower felt suddenly too small, too high, too far from help. "You returned the stolen coins," Voss said, forcing the conversation onto ground he could hold. "Why?" The Strigoi's long fingers flexed, nails dark. "To prove I am not thief," it said. "I do not take their coin. I take their stain. I leave proof for the decent folk. I show them the scales." "And when the scales tip?" Voss asked. The Strigoi leaned forward, nostrils flaring, as if scenting Voss's fear and approving when it found less than expected. "Then I add weight," it murmured, "until balance returns." Voss's stomach tightened. "Your balance has begun to include deserters, debtors." "Deserters steal courage," the Strigoi said, as if reciting scripture. "They steal hope from the line. Debtors steal tomorrow. They eat what is not theirs yet." "That's not theft," Voss snapped, and anger cut through his control. "That is desperation." The Strigoi's gaze sharpened. "Desperation is a choice." It said the word as though it were a verdict. "Every man chooses what he is, and every monster chooses what it pretends to be." Voss shot back. For a moment, the bell tower felt like it might crack under the weight of the stare the Strigoi gave him. Then it spoke again, quieter. "You are not like the others. You do not beg for mercy. You do not bribe. You do not hide. I serve Morr," Voss said. "You serve a door," the Strigoi replied. "I serve a blade." It stepped closer, and Voss felt the air change as if the creature drew warmth out of the stones themselves. "Tell your captain," it murmured, "that the watch is failing. Tell her I am here. Tell her the weak will be protected if the weak stop being weak." Voss swallowed the urge to spit curses. "You cannot protect by killing." The Strigoi's head cocked again, almost curious. "Can you protect by burying?" it asked. "You put them in the ground and call it peace." Then it moved so fast Voss barely registered the blur. A gust of foul cold air, the creak of a beam under sudden weight, and the creature was on the railing, crouched like a gargoyle against the open night. It looked back once. In the dim, its eyes gleamed like wet coins. "Midnight weighs everyone," it said. Then it was gone into the fog, above the roofs. Voss stood trembling, not from weakness, but from the effort it took to keep himself from collapsing into the simple animal truth of what he'd just faced, a predator with a creed. He descended the bell tower like a man climbing down from a gallows. That night proved the Strigoi's creed was widening. Mara Kessel's neighbor, old Edda, was found hung from the beam outside a baker's storehouse. Not a thief, in the usual sense, just a woman who had borrowed flour through a harsh winter and never clawed her way out of the debt. They'd bound her hands with twine. There was no struggle mark on her wrists, only bruises where fingers had gripped. Her feet dangled inches from the ground, toes twitching in the breeze, as if still seeking purchase. The rope was tight enough to leave the face swollen, tongue dark, and her throat again bore the signature of the thing that did not kill cleanly. Coins packed her pockets, weighing her dead body down like ballast. Mara arrived too late to stop herself seeing it. She came around the corner with her basket, heard the crowd's hissed prayers, smelled the blood on the wind, and looked up. Edda's eyes stared out, glassy, accusing nothing and everything. Mara's knees buckled. A sound tore out of her that she didn't recognize as her own. Gert and Halv appeared behind her like shadows. Gert's hand landed on her shoulder, heavy and possessive. "See?" he murmured close to her ear. "Debt is sin now." Mara turned on him with a fury she didn't know she had. "Get your hands off me!" Gert's smile thinned. "Careful. You don't want to look guilty." Mara's throat tightened so hard she could barely breathe. Look guilty, as if fear itself might hang her. And somewhere above, unseen, the town's executioner listened. The rooftop ambush came 2 nights later, when the gangs decided they'd had enough of being prey. They chose the cut-purse crew, 12 men and 2 women who ran the warehouse district like rats ran the sewers. They knew roofs, they knew shadows, they carried cudgels, knives, and short swords. A few had pistols, cheap and unreliable. They climbed after midnight, when the streets below were quiet except for distant, drunken singing and the occasional bark of a dog that didn't know what it barked at. Kranz didn't order the ambush. She learned of it the way she learned most things now, too late. A whisper from an informant, a muttered confession from a frightened thief, a sense of inevitability. By the time she and a handful of watchmen reached the warehouse district, lanterns shuttered, the roofs above had already become a battlefield. A scream ripped through the fog, high and ragged, then cut off, as if someone had grabbed it in a fist. Kranz's blood went cold. She looked up and caught a glimpse of motion. Bodies scrambling over slick slate, shadows colliding. A lantern burst, glass shattering, oil splashing across shingles. Flame flared bright for a heartbeat, painting the scene in savage clarity. A hunched figure in the center, low and fast, moving through the gang like a scythe through wheat. A man swung a cudgel. The figure ducked under it and drove upward with brutal force. Another man stumbled back, clutching his face, and fell hard off the roof edge, his cry fading into a wet crunch below. Then fog swallowed it again. Kranz's men hesitated at the ladders, eyes wide. "Up!" Kranz snapped. "Move!" They climbed, boots slipping, hands shaking on wrung wood. The roof greeted them with chaos, distant thuds, the scrape of bodies, the tinny clatter of dropped weapons sliding down toward gutters. They found one of the gang sprawled on the ridge line, alive but ruined, eyes wide, mouth working soundlessly. He clutched at his throat, blood seeping between fingers. Not an elegant wound, a tearing, a savage, intimate killing. The man's eyes met Kranz's, and in them was not anger, not defiance, only disbelief, like he couldn't accept that there was no bargain to be made. A pistol shot cracked the night. Sparks jumped from slate where the bullet hit. A gang member shouted, "There! There!" and rushed into the fog. What answered him was a blur. The man's shout became a gurgle. Something slammed him into a chimney hard enough to rattle bricks. His knife clattered away. A moment later, his body toppled over the roof edge like a sack of meat. Kranz swung her lantern, trying to cut the fog into shapes. "Hold formation!" she barked, though her voice sounded small on the open roof. The Strigoi did not fight like a man. It did not trade blows or test defenses. It struck where it could end things quickly, and it used fear as a weapon, appearing just long enough to be seen, then vanishing, forcing its prey to spin and stumble and expose themselves. One watchman, a young one, eyes shining with panic, broke and ran. Kranz shouted after him. Too late. A shadow dropped from above. There was a wet impact. The sound of breath punched out. The young watchman hit the slate hard, lantern skittering away. He scrabbled, trying to rise, hands sliding on wet stone. The Strigoi crouched over him, silent. For a heartbeat, Kranz saw its face in lantern light, eyes sunk deep, mouth too wide, expression not rage but certainty, like a judge looking down from a bench. The young watchman raised a trembling hand. "Please." The Strigoi's head tilted, as if listening for something beyond the plea. Then it leaned close enough that its breath fogged the man's cheek. "Afraid," it whispered, and the word sounded like a charge. Then it was gone again, and the watchman lay still, eyes staring up at nothing. Kranz's stomach churned. The killer wasn't just hunting criminals. It was hunting weakness. It was teaching a lesson written in blood. Do not flinch. Do not plead. Do not fear or be judged. When the fog finally swallowed the last of the gang's screams, the roofs went quiet in the way a slaughterhouse goes quiet after the knives are cleaned. Kranz gathered survivors, 2 gang members half mad with terror, one watchman with a broken arm, another vomiting, until only bile came up. Bodies lay below in alleys, twisted in ways that spoke of long falls and sudden stops. And the Strigoi was gone. Rain made his mistake the next day. He doubled down on the spectacle. He ordered the rat-catcher hauled to the square again, announced a public execution to restore order, and made sure everyone saw the gallows being raised. But that night, while Rain slept behind locked doors and Kranz paced the watchhouse like a caged wolf, the town woke to a new hanging. Sergeant Brandt was found at dawn, suspended from a watchhouse beam, not from a warehouse, not from a tavern, from the very place meant to keep law. His uniform was neat, as if he'd been dressed for ceremony. His badge had been polished. His pockets bulged with coin bribes. Returned. The rope was clean, not precise. His throat bore the same savage verdict as the others, and pinned to his chest with a nail was a scrap of cloth, black with a narrow purple band, Morr's color, mocking and proud. Kranz stood beneath the swaying body, unable to look away. She felt the town behind her, gathering in silent ranks, their eyes on the watchhouse like it had been revealed as a lie. Voss arrived and said nothing at first. He only looked up at Brandt, then down at the coins spilling at Kranz's boots like a confession. Kranz's voice came out rough. "It's not punishing lawbreakers," she said, each word tasting like ash. It's replacing us." Voss's expression was grim, but not surprised. "It believes it is the town's executioner," he murmured. "And every day we fail to stop it, more people will start to agree." Kranz's hands shook. She curled them into fists until the trembling eased. "Then how do we stop a thing that thinks it's righteous?" Voss looked past her, up toward the roofs where fog still clung even in morning light, as if the town could not fully scrub the night away. "We don't argue with it," he said quietly. "We tempt it." Kranz turned, eyes narrowing. "With what?" Voss's gaze hardened. "With sin," he said, "displayed, obvious, a crime it cannot ignore. We make a stage the way it does. We hang bait from a beam." The wind nudged Brandt's corpse, making it sway in a slow, accusing arc. Kranz stared at it and felt, for the first time, something colder than fear settle in her chest. Determination. "Fine," she said. "We set the trap, and somewhere above, unseen, something waited patient as stone, already judging whether they would flinch." Chapter 4. Dawn on the Gallows roof. They built the bait the way men built lies in the Empire, with nails, prayer, and the firm belief that if it looked official enough, the world would obey. The wagon wasn't a wagon at all by the time they were done with it. Only a low cart frame stripped of wheels, lashed to planks so it could be dragged over roof ridges and across narrow spans of timber. It would never survive a street it didn't need to. Tonight the streets belonged to fear and empty windows. Tonight the hunt would run above them, where the fog clung and the gutters whispered. They loaded it with 3 iron chests, each stamped with the raven skull seal of Morr. Rain insisted on the stamps. Authenticity, he'd said, as if the Strigoi would be fooled by paperwork. Voss hadn't corrected him. The seals were real enough. The coins inside were not. 1,000 bright discs of cheap metal lay under the lids, plated to look like silver in lantern light, each one cold and dead and meaningless. The real weight wasn't in the chests. It was in what they represented. Temple tithe, funerary dues, sacred coin meant to grease the hinge of death's door. Steal from Morr and you invited curses, even in a town that prayed to Sigmar by day and to luck by night. Sin, Voss had called it, blunt as a shovel. Displayed. Kranz stood on the warehouse roof where the cart waited, breath steaming in the cold. Below, the river slid by like a blade laid flat, black water carrying pale reflections of lanterns and the occasional dead leaf. Across the dock district, rooftops stacked and leaned, as if trying to huddle together for warmth. Fog thickened between chimneys, turning distance into a smear. A watchman was spread in pockets of shadow, crouched behind chimneys, flat on bellies beside ridgelines, boots braced against slick slate. Some wore strips of cloth tied around their wrists, Voss's suggestion, so they could recognize each other in the dark without lantern light. Others had chalk marks on their breastplates, crude raven symbols meant to ward off evil. None of it made Kranz feel safer. She saw the fear in their posture, shoulders too high, hands too tight on weapons, eyes darting. Men and women who had faced riots and river pirates now looked like prey waiting to be reminded it had teeth. Voss moved among them quietly, laying Morr's wards with the patient focus of a mortician. He had ash in a leather pouch, salt in another, and a coil of thin iron chain that he draped along roof beams like a boundary line. At every corner where wood met wood, he whispered the old words that told the dead where they belonged. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He treated the ritual like a lock, and the night like a thief. Rain, of course, couldn't help himself. He stood too upright, cloak too dramatic, lantern held just a touch too high, always wanting the scene to remember him. His men, hired blades and a few watchmen eager for favor, clustered near him like flies near a sweet thing. This will end tonight, Rain murmured, as if speaking it would make it true. Kranz didn't bother replying. She kept her gaze on the roofline beyond, where fog rolled like breath from a sleeping beast. They began the performance near midnight. 2 watchmen picked for steadiness, not courage, dragged the cart across the roof, chains rattling softly. Their boots slid, found purchase, slid again. The chests clinked, as if filled with real wealth. Rain had demanded a public route, warehouse roof to tavern roof to the old counting house, then toward the watchhouse beam where Brant had hung. A trail of temptation, a parade of sin. Kranz let them move, let the cart's noise carry. A hunter had to be heard sometimes. Predators listened. Minutes crawled. The fog thickened, and the world narrowed to lantern glow and wet slate. Somewhere below, a dog barked once, and then went silent, as if it had realized it was alone. Then the air changed. Kranz felt it first in her skin, a sudden cold that wasn't weather, a pressure like something leaning close behind her ear. Several watchmen flinched at once, their bodies betraying them before their minds could. Voss stopped, mid-whisper, his head turned slowly upward, and there, on the roofline above the counting house, crouched a shape that might have been stone if stone could breathe. It was wrong in silhouette, too long in the arms, too hunched in the back, too still in a way that felt intentional rather than natural. Lantern light caught wet slate and wet flesh in the same glinting sheen. Its posture was animal, but its stillness was judicial, like a statue carved to condemn. The Gallows gargoyle, no words, no taunt, no roar. It simply watched the cart, and the men who dragged it, and the hidden bodies that thought they were hunters. Then it moved. It did not run. It flowed down a slope, over a ridge, across a gap where a man would have hesitated. It landed without the slap of boots, only the soft click of nails or bone on slate. For a heartbeat, it was nothing but a blur and a whispering shift in fog. The trap sprang. Voss hissed a phrase and flung a line of salt. Rain shouted an order. Lantern shutters snapped open. Crossbows came up. A pistol barked, loud in the night, and the muzzle flash painted the Strigoi's face in a savage, instant sunken eyes, wide mouth, teeth like broken porcelain. Bolts snapped into the fog. One struck something solid. The Strigoi's shoulder jerked, and black fluid sprayed in a thin arc that vanished into darkness. It didn't slow. It didn't even seem surprised. It hit the first watchman like a battering ram. The man barely managed a yelp before he was lifted off his feet and slammed into a chimney. The impact made brick dust puff into the air. His skull cracked with a sound like a dropped melon. He slid down the chimney, leaving a dark smear, legs kicking weakly for a second before going still. Kranz's men shouted, and the roof erupted into motion. Halberds jabbed. Blades flashed. A lantern swung, spilling light across slate and turning everything into hard shadows. The Strigoi moved through them with brutal economy, no flourishes, no wasted strength. It swatted a halberd aside as if it weighed nothing, then drove forward, shoulder first, into the man holding it. The watchman toppled backward over the roof edge, arms pinwheeling, disappearing into the alley below with a distant, final thud. Another watchman lunged with a sword. The Strigoi caught the blade in its hand. Steel screamed against bone. For a split second the watchman's face lit with hope until the Strigoi twisted. The sword snapped with a sharp crack, the broken edge whipping back to slice the man's cheek open. He screamed, hands flying to his face, and the Strigoi struck him with the other hand, an open-palmed blow that sounded like a butcher slapping meat onto a block. The man's neck kinked at an unnatural angle. He collapsed like a marionette with its strings cut. "Hold!" Kranz bellowed. "Hold your line." But the line wasn't a line. It was a collection of frightened people, and the monster knew it. It turned its head in quick, precise movements, as if listening not to prayers or commands, but to pulse. It found the tremor in a man's stance, the hitch in a breath, the moment a gaze darted away. Afraid, it pounced on fear the way a wolf pounces on limping prey. A watchman near Wren, a veteran with a scarred jaw, took one step back, heel sliding on wet slate. His eyes widened. He raised his crossbow like a shield. The Strigoi was on him instantly, seizing him by the collar and hauling him close enough that Rain's lantern lit the veteran's face in agonized detail, sweat beading, pupils blown wide, teeth chattering around a prayer. "Confession," the Strigoi rasped, voice low and reverent, as if speaking in a chapel. "Fear is confession." Then it hurled him, not off the roof into the cart. The man hit the iron chests with a metallic clang that echoed across the district. The cheap coins inside jingled like laughter. The veteran slumped over the lid, dazed, and the Strigoi followed, claws digging into wood, yanking the lid open with a snap. Silver-colored discs spilled, glittering. The Strigoi stared at them one heartbeat, two as if offended. "Ali?" It turned its gaze toward Voss, and something like rage tightened the monster's features, not the hot rage of insulted pride, but the cold rage of a zealot who has found heresy. "You waif false," it snarled. Rain fired his pistol again. The shot went wide, striking slate and sparking. The Strigoi whipped toward him with a speed that made Kranz's stomach lurch. Rain stumbled back, his face finally shedding arrogance for raw terror. He reached for another pistol, fumbled, and nearly dropped it. Kranz moved without thinking. She threw herself between Rain and the Strigoi, sword up, boots skidding. Her blade met the Strigoi's forearm with a jarring impact that rang up her bones. The creature's limb was hard as old timber. Her sword bit shallow enough to draw dark fluid, not enough to slow it. The Strigoi swung its other hand at her face. Kranz ducked, felt wind and stink pass inches over her head. She thrust upward, aiming for the chest. The Strigoi caught her wrist. Its grip was iron. Pain flared, sharp and immediate. She felt tendons strain. Her sword fell from numb fingers, clattering away into fog. The Strigoi leaned close, eyes glinting like wet coins. Its breath was cold, stale, carrying the faint sweetness of grave rot. "Captain," it whispered, and the way it said the word made it a judgment. Kranz bared her teeth and drove her knee up into its midsection. She expected flesh. She hit something dense, corded, unyielding. The impact jarred her leg. The Strigoi barely rocked. Its grip tightened until white sparks danced in her vision. Behind her, Rain made a strangled sound and began to back away, boots slipping, dignity abandoned. Voss's voice cut through the chaos, louder now, edged with desperation. "Morr's gate, Morr's chain by bone and ash, by grave and name." He threw the thin iron chain forward. It snapped through the air, and for a moment it looked ridiculous, an old priest hurling a line of metal at a nightmare. Then the chain struck the Strigoi's shoulders and caught. Not physically, spiritually. The monster jolted as if shocked. Its skin smoked faintly where the iron touched. It released Kranz with a hiss, like air escaping a wound. Kranz staggered back, clutching her wrist, breathing hard. She grabbed for a fallen halberd to steady herself, fingers still tingling. Voss stepped forward into the lantern light, ash smeared across his palms, eyes hard. "You don't wear justice," he said, voice steady now. "You wear hunger." The Strigoi's lips peeled back. "Justice feeds," it spat. It lunged at Voss. The priest didn't retreat. He slammed his palm ash and salt and prayer against the Strigoi's chest and spoke one word like a nail driven into wood. "Stay." For a heartbeat, the monster froze. not paralyzed, but caught, as if the world itself had snagged its claws. The air around it seemed to thicken, its muscles strained, cords standing out beneath pale skin, and a low, furious sound vibrated in its throat. The ward held, barely. Kranz saw it in Voss's face. The effort, the cost. His lips trembled with the weight of the right. His shoulders hunched as if carrying a body. "Now!" Voss rasped, and it was not a command but a plea. Kranz understood. The ward could slow it. It couldn't stop it forever. The only true jailer for a thing like this was the sun, and dawn was still a long, cruel distance away. The roof around them was a maze of beams and tarred planks, old and dry in places despite the damp, patched and repatched. Lantern oil had spilled. Broken glass glittered. One spark in the wrong place, and the whole district could go up like tinder. Voss's earlier words rang in Kranz's mind. Bind until sunrise. Drop into the river, or let rain's fire take everyone. She looked at the Strigoi held in place by prayer and iron, snarling like a saint turned feral. She looked at Voss, sweat on his brow despite the cold, jaw clenched, eyes burning with grim resolve. She looked at Rain, pale, terrified, already reaching for a torch from one of his men as if fire could solve what steel could not. Kranz made her choice with the clarity of someone who knew there would be no clean victory. "Get the lanterns back," she barked, voice raw. "Shutters closed now. If the roofs catch." Rain shouted over her, frantic. "Burn it! Burn the monster! Burn the roofs! Burn the district if you must better ash than—" "Shut up!" Kranz snarled, and the hatred in her voice surprised even her. She turned to two watchmen closest, their faces streaked with grime and terror. "Axes. The supports. That beam." She pointed to the heavy crossbeam beside the cart, the one the Strigoi had used as a perch, thick enough to bear a hanging body. Beneath it lay open space, a narrow gap where roof met roof over an alley that ran toward the river. "If it falls into the run-off channel," she said. "Fast. Water. We drag it down river." It was mad. It was desperate. It was something. The watchmen hesitated, then moved, because hesitation was already a death sentence. They hacked at the beam with axes, each strike sending splinters flying. The wood groaned. Nails squealed as they tore free. The roof shuddered under the violence. The Strigoi sensed it. Its head snapped toward the beam, then toward Kranz, and its eyes widened not with fear, but with furious comprehension. "You cheat the scales," it hissed, voice thick with hate. Voss's face contorted. "Hurry!" he gasped, the ward straining like a rope about to snap. "I can't." The chain on the Strigoi's shoulders began to smoke more heavily. Its muscles bunched. Its claws dug into slate. The air around it trembled as it pushed against the right, inch by inch, like a man pushing a coffin lid from inside. The beam gave a long, splintering crack. "Now!" Kranz roared. The final axe blow severed the last stubborn section. The beam lurched, shifted, and dropped. For an instant, the Strigoi hung suspended, crouched like a grotesque statue in midair, still clinging by reflex. Then the weight betrayed it. The beam tore loose, and the monster went with it, dropping into the gap with a snarl that turned into a roar as fog swallowed it. Wood smashed against stone. The beam struck the alley's sidewall and splintered further, raining debris. A heavy splash sounded below as broken timber hit the runoff channel leading to the river. Voss stumbled, the ward breaking like a snapped cord. He caught himself on a chimney, breathing hard, eyes unfocused for a moment as if he'd looked into a grave and tasted it. Kranz ran to the edge and looked down. In the lantern light, water churned in the narrow channel. Broken wood bobbed. Something pale moved beneath the surface. A flash of limb, a dragging shadow. Then it was gone, swept toward the river's black mouth. Rain sagged with relief that looked almost like triumph. "See?" he breathed. "We drove it off." Kranz didn't answer. She listened. From somewhere downriver, faint and distant, came a sound that might have been wood creaking, or might have been a low, furious laugh carried on fog. Dawn arrived slowly, as if ashamed to witness what the night had done. Pale light bled into the sky, thinning the fog just enough to reveal the wreckage. Shattered lanterns, blood slick on slate, broken weapons, the dark stains where bodies had fallen. They found 3 watchmen alive but wounded, 5 dead, and 2 missing. Rain's hired blades had fared worse. The cart lay half smashed, cheap coins scattered across the roof like spilled teeth. By the time the sun fully cleared the horizon, townsfolk were already gathering in the streets, staring upward, whispering. The fear had shifted shape. It always did. Where there had been panic, there was now something colder. Suspicion, accusation, people scanning each other's faces for flinches, for guilt, for confession. Rain made a speech before noon, of course. He claimed the night's events as a victory of righteous authority. He implied he'd driven the monster away with his own hand. He promised purges, stricter laws, more hangings. The crowd cheered nervously, desperately, because cheering was safer than silence. Kranz stood beside him, with her wrist wrapped in cloth and her mouth tasting of ash. She watched the faces below, neighbors watching neighbors, merchants watching beggars, husbands watching wives. Fear had become a tool, and the town had learned to hold it. Voss did not stand beside Rain. He stood at the Morr garden gate, alone, listening to ravens and wind. He had a scrap of cloth in his pocket, black with a purple band, and blood under his nails, from clawing a monster off the edge of the world for one night. He knew what the town would do now. They would raise a new beam for lawful executions, sturdier than the old, placed where everyone could see it. They would carve a stone gargoyle on it for luck, because superstition always wanted a charm to cling to. They would hang thieves and deserters and debtors in daylight and call it order. And every time a rope creaked, every time a crowd gasped, the town would remember the monster that had taught them the language of judgment. By evening the new beam stood in the square, fresh timber, sharp edges, a crude gargoyle face chiseled into one corner. Children stared at it wide-eyed. Adults pretended they didn't. The crowd applauded when Ren spoke of restored balance. No one noticed how easily their hands learned to clap for a gallows.